Title: What History Doesn't Tell You About Viking Raids. The first bell is not rung in panic. It is rung because the moon is thin and the tide is low, and the brothers of the island always rise before dawn to read the Psalms. The shore smells of kelp and cold iron. Gulls stitch the air with their needled cries, and a line of foam collapses on the black teeth of the rocks. When the bell swings, it sounds like every morning before it. But on this morning, the men carrying the bell rope keep glancing toward the eastern horizon, because for weeks, the fishermen who ferry grain from the mainland have been talking about strangers. Not a storm that breaks without a cloud in the sky. A rumor with oars. History tells you this is the beginning, because it needs a first page. It gives you a date, 793, a monastery called Lindisfarne, and words that flare like torches. Heathen men, savage, merciless. It tells you that the North came out of nowhere and broke the Christian world in its sleep. But there are other bells, and they ring earlier and not on islands. They ring in the bustling port of Dorestad on the lower Rhine, where Frankish merchants count cloth and wine and mutter about new taxes and the sudden oddity that the men from the north who used to haggle over amber in the market have stopped coming to trade. They ring in a royal hall where a king's counselors argue over where to post his few soldiers this summer. On the roads to deter bandits, or on the coasts to deter what exactly? A people without a name, just a direction. What history doesn't tell you is that the first victims had heard the footsteps, not clearly, not as omens and prophecies, but as loose talk and half-remembered faces. A traveler who wintered in a northern town said he met a man with a boat longer than a church, its spine like the back of a whale, and he heard them laugh about how strange it was that Southerners kept all their gold in the same kind of building with a tower and a bell, and how they rang that bell at the same times every day. The traveler did not think much of it. Men in taverns always brag. What are ships to a farmer's calendar, where hunger and harvest keep the time? The sea knows the time. It knows the shift of tides and winds, the way summer fog lies low on a river mouth and muffles the sound of oars. The men steering those long, narrow hulls know time too, because they are not guessing. They have watched this coast for years, with their eyes half-lidded so they look stupid, the way a hawk looks stupid when it is too high to be seen by the sparrows. They were traders before they were raiders, and they were scouts long before that. They took your language home in their mouths and chewed on it by their fires until it softened. They learned the word for prayer and the word for tax. They learned that your king had a son who liked to fight his cousins more than he liked to guard his own coasts. Stand on that island with the brothers and watch the line along the water. It is not yet a shape. A gull keeps darting and then banking away, irritated by something that cuts the surface like a fin. One monk shades his eyes. He has seen seals and whales and all manner of driftwood. He has not seen this, though it has seen him. When the black lines become carved prows and the pale oblongs resolve into sails, they seem to have grown out of the mist fully formed, not because they are supernatural, but because your attention was elsewhere. Your attention was on the bell. The bell is what they counted on. You have been told the Vikings were chaos. You have not been told how patient they were, how they would sit in a marsh, sipping water that tasted of rot, and watch a village for 3 days, testing the middle of the night by throwing pebbles at dogs to see which houses flare first with lamplight. You have not been told that before they burned a monastery, they often sent men disguised as traders to attend mass, to stand near the back and stare at the floor like half-pious farmhands, and count the keys on the abbot's belt. Monks tell stories in their chronicles about monsters and punishment, because that is their language for moral disaster. They do not write about the cleverness of the men who hurt them, because cleverness feels blasphemous then. Yet cleaving an unarmored man with an axe is only the end of a long arithmetic. The arithmetic begins at home. A fjord is beautiful, and a farm can be made on a strip of sunshine between rock and black water. But in the 8th and 9th centuries, a son is a problem. Not because he is sinful, because inheritance law is awkward, and land is not stretching to match his hunger. Fathers divide fields and pastures like loaves of bread, and each generation the slices get thinner. A young man can borrow a cousin's meadow or drive his sheep higher until winter teaches him the exact number of nights a hungry ewe will live. He can also leave if he can get a boat, if he can convince others that the risk is less than the dishonor of staying poor. He can go in the one direction where the wind and the legends both say opportunity lies. Honor and need ride in the same hull. You can feel the planks flex as the sea lifts the bow. You can smell the sour pitch and the animal fat rubbed into the ropes. The oars are not pounding a rhythm like in the old movies. They are quiet and quick, and the men at them do not waste their breath on songs, because they might need to haul the hull up a beach and back into the water 3 times before noon. The mast is a promise, not a guarantee. It gives them speed when there is wind, and a shadow to hide the deck when there is not. The sail is dyed with a pattern that makes the hull harder to judge from a distance, a trick of light. Their ancestors learned this trick hunting whales. They learned the trick of reading the color of the sea to see a sandbar. They learned to feel the wind in their gums, a seamanship that is as physical and private as the way an old blacksmith can tell the heat of iron by the taste of the air near the forge. When the prow touches sand on that island, many things happen very quickly. Men run. One falls. Another drops the cross he was carrying, and it tumbles end over end and lands half buried, so later generations will misunderstand the photograph. A door that was meant to keep the cold wind out does no such thing against a boot and a shoulder. A girl whose name will not be written down hides under a table, as polished wood splits and the chalice shivers on the stone. You know this scene, or at least you know the way it has been painted. What you may not know is that before the ships left their home fjord, the leader of this band swore before a ring of iron in a little hall and promised that the silver would be weighed fairly, and that no man would steal from his crew. That when they left, they counted every iron rivet in the boat, because they had learned the hard way what breaks at sea is not easily replaced on a storm-swept coast. That they carried not just axes, but little balances with bronze needles and sets of weights nested like dolls, each marked with a nick that corresponded to the ones cut in the beams of their own homes. We walk into a world where money is not paper nor coin, at least not in the way you think. In the North, before kings stamp their faces on discs and demand you accept that as trust, value is measured by weight and promise. When you hear that the raiders wanted gold, you imagine a dragon's hoard. In truth, they want silver, and not for the reason the chroniclers thought. In the east of the world beyond your horizon, along rivers that will later be called the Volga and the Dnieper, caravans carry little silver coins with Arabic script. A merchant can get those coins in a market where spices smell like promises, and where the language of God is written from right to left. Those coins travel north into cold markets where seal fat burns and fish dries on racks, and they are chopped into bits called hack silver, because a weight is a weight is a weight. A band of men who can swim their hull up a tidal river to the door of a monastery and carry off its chalices can turn those cups into trade, and those trade goods into alliances. They are not just stealing, they are feeding a machine of ambition that runs on glittering metal, furs, and lives. Slaves are part of that machine, and this is a part of the story that the romantic fog does its best to cover. A word that will become our word for a people, Slav, will become a general word for captive. The raiders take monks, and they take women, and they take boys who can be trained to row. In future weeks, a camp will rise by a river bend, not far from this first island, a little sprawl of huts made of turf and driftwood. You will hear it called a longfort in Irish annals, a ship fort, and from it will grow a town where men will marry local women, and boats will be built side by side with barns. There is not a neat line between a raid and a settlement. There is an edge, and they slide along it, as the tide slides along the shore, back and forth with the season and the price of grain. When they say they came and went like ghosts, what is meant is that they came to stay when it suited them, and left before an army could assemble. How do you time a raid? The answer is not magic. It is simpler and more humiliating. You watch your enemy's calendar, and you learn that there is a day every year when most of the men who can fight are gathered far from their villages, because a king wants to be seen, or a saint is to be honored, or an assembly is being held to settle oaths. You learn the rhythm of markets. that a certain port is loud and careless on certain days when the weavers come. You learn the church's liturgy better than some priests, because you know when the candles are lit, and when the bell is rung, and when the brother's attention is turned toward heaven. They use our predictability against us, says a voice that comes much later from a dusty book. But in the moment, the monks do not think of predictability. They think of mercy and judgment. They write that God is angry. The raiders hope God is busy elsewhere for an hour. An hour is enough. A raid is a minute, a handful of heartbeats, where the point of being here is to stop being here as soon as your sacks are heavy. At the end of that hour, the boats are lower in the water and the wind is shifting. If the raiders think they can find another target before dog packs scent them, and riders bind their legs to their horses and spur west, they may continue up the river you did not know was deep enough for this kind of ship. Rivers are roads for them. The little half-hidden cuts of water that you use to float logs are highways when you draft a hull so shallow you can drag it over a sandbar with 40 hands. In 2 days, they can be in a place you think of as inland. They are not sea raiders. They are amphibians. They slip into the landscape and glide along it, eyes just above the surface. History leaves out what that feels like, inland, on the sound of the oars. You hear them before you see them, a slosh that does not fit your river, a susurrus with order. You think at first it is wind in reeds. Then you think it is a flock of geese, until the shadows cross the sunlight on the water, and you see wood like the back of a snake. Panic is not loud at first. It is disbelieving. A farmer looks up from a flooded field and squints. He has heard of the sea, but never seen it. The sea has come to him with men in it. Later he will remember the red of the shields. That is another trick of light. The shields are red because red makes fire look brighter. Because everything about the raid is a calculation. Even the fear is weighted. If you follow one crew back to their coast, if you follow them not just this time, but 3 summers later, you will see a change that history compresses into a sentence. They stop leaving after the harvest and coming home before winter. They begin to stay. They pitch tents on a spit of land near a town with a stone church. What begins as a camp turns into a fortified winter base. They mend sails with wool bought at a fair and exchange amber for grain. They swear oaths not just to each other, but to a local lord who needs men who are good in boats. He calls them not enemies, but auxiliaries, and pays them in coin and charters. They write nothing about this. The monastery that burns writes about it later, reluctantly. The people in between, fishermen, salt panners, women setting eel baskets in the mud, do not write. They begin to live with the raiders as facts. The truth that hides inside the word raid is how often the axe does not fall. The same men who tip a chalice into a sack today will give gifts next year to the saint in a church down the river, because they have married into a family there, and their child is sick, and you do not tempt any god's anger when you have family buried in a place. The way the story is told later, we imagine blocks, Christian and pagan, north and south, raider and victim. The way it happened feels more like weather, storms, calms, fog. A man is a raider one year, and the next he is a merchant. And the year after that, he is a guard outside a bishop's hall, paid to watch the road where he once walked unseen. He is the same man, with the same scars, but the oath he has sworn this winter is a different one, and oaths are heavy when bound to silver and to suns. We look for one secret to explain how a people can appear to be everywhere at once. A compass, a spy, a devil's compact. The secret is smaller and more frustrating. It is that the people they struck wrote their histories for morals, and morals are blind to logistics. It is that the raiders were artists of time and tide, in a world where most maps were prayers, where most journeys were circles from field to field and back again. It is that they trained their ears to the bell, and they sharpened their hunger to the shape of other men's calendars. If that sounds unromantic, know that unromantic precision wins wars as surely as courage does. The courage is there. It is in the way a man leans into the oar when the wind kicks up and the water turns white, and his hand slips on the haft because it is greasy with old tallow. The precision is in the way he counts heartbeats under his breath, to keep pace so the hull does not yawl on the sandbar and break its ribs. A chronicler after Lindisfarne writes in a shaking hand that this was a sign. He is not wrong. It was a sign of the beginning of something a century long, not only of burning, but of settlement, of money changing hands and words changing mouths. And even as he scratched the word barbarian into the margin, men whose grandchildren would build stone churches on Irish rivers were already planning a different kind of season. They were thinking what would happen if instead of stealing your gold and going home, they demanded you weigh it for them yourself, year after year, and call it tax. The word will be Danegeld, and men will say later that once you pay off a Viking, you never get rid of him. That is true in a way they do not intend. Once you pay him, he is inside your economy. He is inside your calendar. He knows your weak weeks and your poor harvest years. He is not at the gate. He is in the ledger. Listen again to the bell on that island. It keeps time for prayer. It keeps time for plowing too, and for dinner, and for the meeting of men at the shore when the boats come with salt and news. In the seasons to come, the bell will ring more often, not just for fear. It will ring for fares. It will ring for ships that fly across on their sails, and for ships that fly no emblem at all, but bring in their holds glass and silk and wine from places nobody here will see. And some nights it will not ring when it should, because the men who should be ringing it will be sitting in the dark, listening for oars. If you want to know what history doesn't tell you about Viking raids, begin with those men in the dark, and with the patience in their fear, and with the men on the water whose patience made their fear meaningful. Because there is another sound to learn, a sound that does not fit comfortably into the pretty pictures and the neat myths. It is the tiny click of a balance needle finding its rest in the palm of a man's hand, aboard a ship that smells of tar and salt, as the weight of a cut piece of silver tells him whether a promise has been kept. That, more than the clash of iron or the roar of fire, is the heartbeat you will hear again and again when you walk through these years. To follow it, we have to leave the edge of the Atlantic and ride a river east, past birch forests and steppe grass, toward markets where the script looks like prayers, and the silver flows like water. The next part of this story is not about blood on stone, so much as numbers in a world that does not write them down. And once you see that, the raids stop looking like thunder and start to look like the weather preceding trade. Before we go east, though, look once more at the horizon from the island. More sails are coming. Not today, on a day when the wind smells of kelp and iron again, and when another brother rings the bell because it is his turn. He will look out and count 7 shadows, and then 10, and he will think to himself that there were fewer last time. He will not know that the difference is not only hunger or courage, it is organization. It is agreements made in low halls lit by seal oil, with one stipulation written not on parchment, but on pride. That every crew will arrive when the tide is right, even if it means rowing through a night so black you have to trust the hiss of the water against the rocks because there is no other guide. What set them apart was not simply their appetite for risk. It was their mastery of time. To see what that mastery meant, to see how it let a handful of coastal farmers put their hands around a continent's throat, we must follow the silver that made it all possible. From the grave goods of kings to the purse of a man who never touches a sword. The bell at Lindisfarne never really stops tolling in this story. Its echo rolls outward and eastward, carried across wet fields, up estuaries, through the low marsh sigh of the North Sea. Out there on another morning, something else marks the hour. Metal on metal, a bright, precise sound. It is the clink of a weight on a scale in a market that is more post than town, more staging ground than home. Aldegeborg, the place later called Staraya Ladiga. The fog lifts off the Volkhov like breath from a sleeping ox. Men in wool cloaks stand over a trestle table. A thin copper weight, shaped like a small animal, swings to stillness. A finger nudges it, not to adjust, but to listen. You can hear a man's honesty in his balance if you've tuned your ear long enough. The coin on the pan is not meant to be a coin anymore. It is silver by weight, a dirham from far south and east. Its Arabic script a rail of calligraphy the Norse can't read, but treat with peculiar respect. They know some marks mean new silver, Some mean debased. They nick the coin, taste it, bend it. Then the blade goes down and the dirham jumps into 3 glittering fragments. Hack silver, ready to be weighed again. This is not looting performed by brute hands. This is habit, ritual, arithmetic. The clink of calibrated weights answers a question more important than any war cry. How much? Around them, the river traffic glides like an assembly line. From the north come bundles of furs that feel like cold, living things when you press them to your face. Sable, marten, beaver, fox. From the woods, shackled men shuffle in pairs, branded and terrified, traded by intermediaries who speak Finnic or Slavic. The word slave will survive this era in the name of a people. From the west, amber. From the east, beads green as young barley, beads that will find their way into graves across Scandinavia by the handful. Their glass not just decoration, but proof. Receipt beads that show a woman's household is plugged into a network bigger than any king. The men at the table wear rings whose iron has been handled so often it's gone smooth and dark. They count out falcons too. Their hoods dampen the eyes and frenzy of white northern birds prized in courts as far as Baghdad. The birds are lighter than silver, but dearer. All these things, skins, people, feathered predators, become interchangeable because every exchange is processed through measure. Nothing escapes the pan. The bell has become the balance. The river routes pull these traders the way tides pull longships, but rivers have their own calendars. Up the Volkhov to Lake Ilmen, then down the Lavat and over into the drainage of the Dnieper, if that is your route to Byzantium and its gold mosaic world. Or from Ilmen up the Msta and across to the Volga. If what you want is the Caspian and then a caravan road to cities with lamps that never go out and markets that make even a raider's eyes go wide. But neither path is free running water. Between them are places where boat becomes burden and time becomes the only law. Portages that are measured not in miles, but in the number of shoulders you can spare before the frost returns. They plan departure with the bloom of alder catkins, and arrival with the last open water before the rivers lock their jaws. The men who stood at Lindisfarne with oars timed to heartbeats now count days by flood crest and ice edge. At the big carries between the Lavat and the Dnieper headwaters, or on the Volga's side channels, they have stashed sledges under brush the previous season. If the spring thaw came early, they grease planks for skins. If it came late, they use a different plan. Every tactic is bracketed by a date. A man who breaks rhythm here doesn't just miss a raid, he loses a year. And above these physical clocks run the human ones. Tolls, taxes, markets that open for set windows. On the Volga, the Khazar Khaganate will take your silver with courtly manners. Men in bright kaftans, belts loaded with small metal tags, count out your cargo where the river widens into controlled water. The collector's assistant holds a scale that looks not so different from yours. The empire of the steppe skims its share from everyone, not by blade at the throat, but by a nib of reed across parchment. You pay, and in return you get safety, stamped on a lead seal. That seal is time. It keeps you from being stopped again for 7 days downstream, a promise that lasts exactly as long as the scribe's ink. The Norse call men who do this work customs men, and some of them will end their days as those same officials, because in a world that runs on weighing, the one who holds the weights rules without noise. These accountants on horseback are not the only peril. The Pechenegs and other steppe riders don't wait behind tables. They wonder when the portage season begins too, and they know that at the rapids on the Dnieper, men with their boats on rollers cannot fight and ferry at the same time. At Eifer, the ever-furious, the water crushes its teeth over black stone. Here the river is all white breath and roar. The primary chronicle, composed long after by a Christian scribe in a different voice, will list the names of the rapids as if they are devils. Esipi, Galandri, Eifer, Varafors. The Norse have their own names for the places where men die. You can hear them shout, and you can hear the sudden hush when they hear a whistle from the reeds, and understand there are eyes watching from the Manx. The schedule is not just for profit now. It is for survival. Get across by noon, or be under arrows by afternoon. In this country, time bleeds. Of all the clocks in this net of rivers, one is made of pure number. The dirham carries its date in the script that loops across its face. Not 1 in 100 in the north can read "in the name of God," or the names of caliphs, governors, mints, Wasit, Samarkand, Al-Muhammadiyah, but they learn patterns. Certain curls, certain dots, those mean the silver is good. The rest they test with bite and blade. They admire the consistency with a craftsman's heart. It is the Islamic world's honest habit of stamping years that will give modern archaeologists their time grid for the north. But it also gave the northern traders a simple rule they could feel in their fingers. Newer coins are often truer. Men out of the Gulf and Khorasan bring coins with wet ink dates. Those get a better price. Older coins still go in the bag, turned into shards that fill a hand with shine. We imagine Vikings as ship shouters, but many of these men spend their days in quiet haggling, their nights tallying in their heads. They come home to farms where women keep keys on iron rings at their belts and balances in their chests. Archaeologists have found more scales in women's graves than you'd expect if you thought only of raiders. Someone cut the silver in the long winter evenings. Someone weighed beads and cloth and sorted out the tax for the local chieftain. Someone put dirham fragments into a bag and buried it under the hearthstone when a horse on the road sounded wrong at dusk. A household that plans is a ship that sails even when it's not on water. You can mistake them because the quiet, competent ones never make the saga lines. Consider just one coin, minted in Samarkand in the year you would call 817. Its Arabic date keyed to a calendar that began with a flight from Mecca. Its silversmith's hands stained black up to the knuckle. It jingles in a caravanman's purse across a strip of salted desert under a sky that blisters the air. It pays tax to a governor with a seal like a sunflower. It moves north in winter because camels walk better in the cool. It crosses the Caucasus in a bundle with others and meets a river like an easy promise, then a bigger river, then a sea that smells like rot and fish. It reaches a counting table under a felt canopy where men in hats discuss rates in 3 languages. A tenth is cut off, neat as bread. The rest gets a Khazar stamp. Onward, north. A Bulgar trader with gold rings in his ears turns it twice, grunts, spits, passes it. In Ladoga it becomes 3. A woman's hand takes one of those 3, and in 2 generations a girl will bury it with combs and beads somewhere in Gotland, a hoard long enough to fit the forearm. When you look into that hoard now, what you see is not loot. You see a clock. Nothing here is isolated. The same men who carried dirhams home bring back news. They learn the price of furs in Bulgar this year is better because a courtier in Baghdad has a new wife who despises moss. They hear that a flood drowned fields by the Dnieper. Expect more starving men for sale and a harder edge in the bargaining. They pick up words, Ruskaya for the people on this river, Bezmen for the scale, Sudno for boat. Some will end up as mercenaries in a Slavic prince's retinue for a winter, paid not in coin, but in permission to trade unmolested. Some will swear to a Greek emperor, but not yet. First there is the treaty at the end of the Dnieper road, the one that sets rules for how men from the north may enter the greatest market of all. In Constantinople they are not called Vikings. They are Ras or Varangians, and they are given a number before they are given a bowl of porridge. They must come in set groups. They must surrender their weapons outside the gates and wash in the bathhouse. A ritual for the emperor's peace, but also a way to mark time. You cannot trade more than a certain number of days. You get a lead token that allows entry into certain districts. If you misbehave, the official who issued that token loses his place. It is bureaucracy with a soldier's bluntness, and beneath the pomp and indigo cloth, there are sandglasses and candle clocks and clerks who say no. The treaties of 907, 911, 944, whether you trust every line or not, glow with administrative detail. Set hours, fixed prices for rope, sails, food, penalties scaled by offense. The North meets an empire that can manage it with rules. The shock is not swords on shields, it is numbers on parchment. If you pull this far south by river and survive, the prize is markets ordered by time. The Norse watch men in tall caps buy and sell as if their lives depended on schedules no storm can break. Grain brought in on Saint So-and-so's day, oil delivered by the fourth watch, court meetings ruled by the emperor's son. They see where great wealth comes from, through control of time and measure. and they take that lesson home, as surely as they take home silk for their wives' sleeves. Up the Volga and into the Caspian, a different world of clocks. In the Caliph city, you wake not to a bell, but to the human bell, the call to prayer ripping the dawn into 5 known pieces. The men from the north cannot argue with a calendar that sounds in the air and makes the crowd kneel. This too is a discipline that orders trade. Markets close, men stop. For a society tuned to tides, the regimented breath of the day carved by faith is startling. They adapt. They meet brokers after prayer. They learn that the mint in Bukhara is issuing good coin this decade, and that a certain governor is clipping wages. These rumors are as valuable as a chest of silver, because if you know where the scale is honest, you know where to point your boat. Even the dangers knit the network tighter. Raiders who strike a monastery in the west with sunrise sense the same mood in a steppe camp when a horse screams unexpectedly at dusk. The toolkits begin to look the same. Not just axes and spears, but awls, wax tablets, weights, bits of dyed cloth cut to standard lengths. A sword is only one instrument. Much finer, much more dangerous to a people who have never faced it, is the habit of treating every part of life as a question of timing and measure. You can conquer with that, without laying a hand on a door. It makes the stories harder to tell the old way, with heroes who win because God smiles or because a berserker spits enough blood. There are heroes here, but their victories have more to do with rawhide ropes hauled across granite at the exact right hour, and with a chief who knows to wait for the calving of ice. They have to do with the patience to sit by a river bend for 6 days until the tax window opens, and then to move like water through a loophole. It is a kind of courage that will never look good in a drinking hall tale. But even the best clocks break. The seafloor of this economy is not the North Sea. It is a mountain range in Central Asia, where men chip silver out of stone and turn it into discs in a mint courtyard. When the oar tightens and the caliph's grip loosens, when governors begin to debase more aggressively and the camel trains arrive lighter, the tone of those bright market mornings on the Volkhov changes, almost imperceptibly at first. The balance pans jerk more often as weights are swapped and checked. The nick on the rim of a dirham bites deeper. A man who could once judge the quality of his wealth by the luster now stares at a date and scowls. By the mid-10th century, the rush of dirhams north will slow to a cough. This is not just a monetary quirk. It is a weather change for a civilization. If the silver dries up, or shifts, or is lopped by a new toll, you need some other way to keep score. Across Scandinavia, local chieftains with a nose for this danger begin to mint their own coins. Thin flans with names like Sigtuna or York, knowing that authority sticks better if it jingles by the same weights and measures as an empire's. Pack silver still serves, but king silver talks. The moment is subtle, but you can hear the future in it, a different cadence in the metal music. The bell from Lindisfarne becomes a mint stamp in Upland, a seal on a treaty in the Dnieper marsh, a candle burned to a marked line in the palace on the Bosporus. The road east has taught the men from the north a lesson that their enemies never quite learned to respond to. That power is time made visible. It is the calendar of when you launch, and when you pay, and when you pray, and when you feed your men, and when you appear in a hall with silk on your shoulders and a gift of falcons. Right then, at the hour that makes the other side think you keep a different sort of god. Once you see the world like this, raiding is just one edge of a very large blade. The human cost sits in the shadow of this efficiency like a dog under a table. Every shining copper weight in Ladoga is paired with a child somewhere on a chain. Every perfect dirham date sings through an auction of people as if it were a bell in another building. Organized time makes organized suffering possible on a scale a handful of pirates could never manage. You cannot pull the world into rhythm without dragging the unwilling into the beat. In the next breath, the geography will change again. The old wet roads of the rivers will empty into a walled city that thinks of itself as the center of the earth, where the emperor's servants mark hours with water dribbling through glass, and where the men from the north will discover a new way to be inside the ledger instead of at the edge of it. The treaties have set the hours. The guardroom doors are open. And somewhere far away in Samarkand, a mint that used to chime like a bell has gone quiet for a season. A silence that will travel by boat and by rumor and by hunger all the way to a snow-lit farm in Upland, where a woman with keys at her belt will wait for a scale to settle and hear in its hesitation that something in the world has slipped. What happens when the sound of silver falters, and the empire that keeps the biggest clock invites the rivermen not just to trade at its gates, but to hold its doors? The story we followed downstream is about to walk inside. Before sunrise on the Bosporus, the water is a sheet of slate, unmarked by wind. Torches along the seawalls sputter as the night watch marks the hour on a tower drum. Beyond the dark ribbon of the Golden Horn, a chain like a submerged serpent holds the harbor shut, each iron link glistening with dew. In the watchhouses, men whisper prayers to the measured rhythm of their lives. The bells of Hagia Sophia will peal at dawn. The gate ledger will open. The city will exhale. This place has learned to govern not only streets and ships, but the very hours themselves. A patrol on the outer current pauses and squints east. At first the line is only a rumor on the rim of water. Then it resolves into shapes the city knows too well. Long hulls, low and lean as brushstrokes, coming with the tide, not against it. But there is no drumbeat, no war cry. When the first ship reaches the signal point, a man lifts a stamped strip of lead into the lantern light. A seal, a promise pressed into metal that outlasts breath, tells the sleepy guard what matters most. These men are expected. They carry a calendar with them. They are entering on time. Somewhere in the palace, a bureau clerk is already chalking the day's allotments on a wax tablet. If this were a century earlier, panic would have outrun the oars. There was a time when the sight of these ships meant fire on water, a sky torn into by thunderous panic bells. The chain of the Golden Horn dragged taut and screaming. People still tell that story, the day the rivermen came, not with seals, but with sails red as sunrise. The year when the mother of cities felt a hand on her throat. Earlier raids on Constantinople were remembered not for their loot, but for their lesson. In 860, the city went to sleep confident in walls that had held off Persians and Arabs, only to stagger awake to shrieks from the suburbs and masts crowding the sea like a forest of spears. It was an attack that seemed to come out of time, from a north the empire measured only in hunting stories and slave rumor. The attackers threw themselves at the seawalls and were answered with alchemy, the hiss and roar of a liquid that burned on water, a measured stream from brass dragons' heads that ate ships and courage and the night itself. The city learned to count the seconds it took to turn a lever, to know exactly how many moments of terror it could pour into an enemy's open mouth. And the rivermen learned too. If you could not take the city by hour, you could take it by calendar. What followed were sheets of rules ground out by a machine that outlasted generals. In their treaties, the empire taught the rivermen how to arrive, not with war, but with papers. The texts that survive in echoes, copied into chronicles, remembered in law, read like recipes. The foreigners may come in approved months, one place of harbor only, never more than 50 in a band. Upon reaching the city, they must present themselves at a certain gate, surrender their weapons into the hands of doorkeepers whose names are written down, then receive tokens in return. They will live for a set number of days in a suburb assigned for their markets. No more. They may bathe, they may buy bread, they may sell furs, wax, slaves, and honey, but only where the empire can watch the stales. The logothete notes the baths allowed per week, the exact gifts the emperor will bestow, bolts of silk, countable gold numismata, more than honor, less than bribe. It is all weighed. On the wharf at Neorion, beneath warehouses stamped with imperial eagles, their cargoes come out like the insides of winter, sable and marten, piled in soft drifts, tusks and amber, caged hawks hooded like monks. The empire responds with a different cold, gold struck to a shine that seems to hum, measured cloth that carries the weight of 1,000 mulberry leaves. Beside every bale and chest stand men with stathmoi, steelyards, whose little lead riders skate back and forth, clicking. The sound is like bones knocking. Nothing moves here without measure. Not arms, not silks, not favors, not even these men. They feel the city's time in their bodies. At dawn a bell, at third hour a bath if permitted. At sundown a shutter nailed. The foreigner's quarter is ringed with law disguised as hospitality. There is even an hour to be astonished. When invited into the palace precinct to receive gifts, they walk between groves of bronze trees that breathe and roar, seeing lions made of hinges that lift gilded paws, hearing birds that sing without lungs. They learn a second lesson. There are people who can bend time into loops and place it inside animals. A visitor will later write about a throne that vanishes into the ceiling and comes back down different. Emperors who seem to dance up and down the hours as if they were steps on a ladder. On another wall, a water clock drips the day into chambers. One spout releases an hour into a tiny garden of lead flowers that fold and unfold when time touches them. The rivermen, who learned their numbers from nets and oar strokes and the length of a stride along a keel, watch time turned into spectacle. A city like this cannot be taken by surprise. It has replaced nerves with gears, and yet rumors of alarms continue to travel faster than treaties. Far away, in households where winter bites harder, small balances live in chests like pets. Women with keys at their belts click open oak boxes and lay silver on scales that fit in their palms. They have hardened their eyes into measures. A mid-century wind slows to a stop. The flow of dirhams along the eastern rivers, once so steady a man could set his year by it. Samanid coins thin and then falter. Traders bring fewer velvet bags stamped with Arabic prayers. The clicks of balances in farmhouses and long forts grow more nervous. People get good at cutting crescents of silver from old bracelets, turning currency back into weight. What happens when the empire of measure at your back has a coin drought? You mint your own clock. Up in York, on streets still marked by timber palisades and fresh words, a hammer rings a new rhythm. Dies bite bright discs that say this city belongs to itself. Names of kings you will not recognize at first sight surface like bubbles in a well. Canute, Anlaf, countless ephemeral rulers with their faces held tight by tongs. In Sigtuna and Hedeby, people who grew into raiding by rowing learn to grow into ruling by hitting a stamp on time. It is a strange alchemy. Raids turn into mints. Fear becomes finance. When the East's silver river slackens, the North begins to make its own stream. You can feel the muscles in Sanbis world shift, tightening around a new spine. Stories travel with the new coins. At a winter feast, someone, was it a skald who had seen the Bosporus, or a younger man who had only listened, sings of a day when a prince laid his shield on a city's gate. A circle of iron pinned to stone, as if to say, "We were here, our measure matters." Whatever the truth of that episode, the audience hears only this: the gate felt a northern hand. In the minds of people who count by season and voyage and death, the line between myth and calendar entry is thin. A story told loudly enough becomes an anniversary. Back in the south, a quieter conquest begins. Men who once rose up in the foam to slam into sea walls now learn to stand. After a prince in a river city converts and makes a bargain with a purple-born emperor, a cohort of axe-bearers marches into the palace, bringing with them the raw hours of a northern morning. They come as gifts and guarantees. They come with oaths around their arms like rings. They swear into a hierarchy that eats oath-breakers and places keepers at the doors. They are given a place not at the table, but beside it. They watch the doors. In the walls of Constantinople's innermost rooms, the air does not smell like fish or pine tar. It smells like incense and wax and the human breath of ceremony. The axe-bearers, pale-eyed and bored past their own bones, learn to count in beats they had never felt before. An emperor's procession must move down the marble hall to a chant that takes exactly so long. A liturgy unspools like braided rope. They are taught where to stand, which foot to shift weight to while the patriarch speaks, how to step as the mechanical birds sing so that a visitor sees them when the throne rises. Someone tells them the names of the doors, not all in their own language. The Bronze Gate, the Gate of the Sky. They keep their fingers on keys large as a child's arm. Without thinking, they tap the halves of their axes in time to the clicks of palace hydraulics. Not that the old fire is gone. A generation earlier, men who looked like them came at the city the wrong way, again. In 941 they crowded the sea with hulls, and thinking the machine had grown old and slow, met streams of burning liquid that bloomed like poisonous flowers on the water. There are ballads about men jumping overboard to roll in a sea that would not quench them, of oars blazing, of a night that screamed with mothers' names in languages that did not reach the walls. The survivors took back to the north not only scars, but a new respect for valves and pipes and calendars. On those river routes after, campfires spread retellings like fungus. Somewhere in the telling, the fury softens and the edges sharpen into something else. You cannot take this place with a shout. You can only enter it with a whisper and a seal, or be asked in with a promise. While these men are counting steps inside an emperor's house, the West hears another kind of counting. On a muddy field, a Frankish king counts his piece in silver disgorged from a chest, at a set rate per year. The word for it bites like a shovel, geld. Danish coins glint in cloistered light, their legends spelling names in a script that does not belong to the monks reading them. The countryside learns days as debts. Sheriff and reeve and tax gatherer stand not with axes, but with cut tallies and write time into wood with knives. Markets schedule themselves with bells so exact that fish rot less and bread tears evenly. In Dublin, long halls that smell of brine and smoke count bodies with a regularity that will make modern stomachs heave. Men and women stand in lines not formed by fear of a blade, but by the rhythm of a market day. Even in disgust, you hear the machine tick. Through all of it ripples smaller lives. A woman in a farmhouse taps the side of her box and says a name you will never know, and lays down a pair of bird-shaped weights she saved from her mother. In stone all across Sweden, runes cut by expensive hands tell the quietest truth of this age. He died in Greece. He went to the east with the good ship. He took wages in the land of the Greeks. Money paid on a cycle sculpts grief into letters. In the space between those lines lurks a precise wage schedule for an axe and a body, priced by people who did not weep when they wrote it. If this sounds like an empire swallowing its enemies with kindness and protocol, listen harder. The city is not a stomach. It is a clock that only seems to absorb while it is actually sinking everything around it. Those rivermen, who learned first to time a tide, then the swing of a village bell, then the clicks of a steelyard at a Kagan's toll booth, now learn the grammar of acclamation, the rate at which silk rustles, the unspoken rule of when to speak and when to be a door. When a rebellion cracks like ice in spring somewhere in the palace, orders run not on courage, but on time. Hold the doors. The words bounce down corridors glazed in gold leaf. The men with axes move, bodies clean with oil, faces blank as a weight-stamped surface. They know where the hinges are. They know now what a moment costs. The Empire has given them a new toolkit for power. It has taught them to hire their rage out by the hour, and then to bank the hours in gold. It has shown them how to turn a ship's discipline into a hallway's discipline. And in return, they have given the Empire something it needed, a hand unconnected to any noble house in the city, a guard that can turn on account when told. Outsiders, paid to keep a rhythm, swear to a throne rather than a family. This is the purest use of time as a weapon. It cuts through kinship. Away from the palace, the consequences ripple, because the flow of silver became a trickle. Cities that had been seasonal, York in winter, Dublin in spring, learned to stay awake all year. Because a handful of princes agreed to receive pay an hour of someone else's time, the North's myth of self-enough hardens into the structure of rule. Because a door inside a palace closed on command at the right minute, a man loses a crown in a midnight exile, and another gains it before dawn. Because a woman in a village learned to weigh silver without blinking, a household can send a son to earn 20 numismata in a southern guard. Because the Empire writes a treaty that tells you how many companions can walk through a gate, a poet writes a song about a shield on that gate. When you stop thinking of raiding as a flurry of blades and start hearing it as a series of clocks sinking across a world, the story shifts from heroics to habit. Habit is harder to break. So stand now for a moment with one of those men, outside one of those doors. The room beyond holds a man with the title Basileus, ringed with curtains and voices and small precise movements. The hinges are so well made, they do not sing. The gold is so old it glows like a banked ember. You can see the future steaming at the edges. He lets his breath slip out slow. Somewhere down on the harbors, a clerk double-checks a list of rust boats leaving with bolts of cloth, measurements curled on parchment. Somewhere far to the west, a priest tolls a bell that tells a village it is time to stop answering to men and start answering to the hours. Somewhere in the woods north of Novgorod, a girl tilts a scale and watches the pointer settle. The man at the door rolls his shoulders, the haft of his axe warm now against his palm. He does not think about Lindisfarne. He thinks about a key. Power here is not only in who commands an army, but in who decides when a door opens. And we are at the threshold of a secret history in which the supposed barbarians become the keepers of ceremonial time, the ones who decide, with a flick of a wrist and a glance to a steward's nod, whether the world's most magnificent room will admit the next scene. Records will later say they were loyal, that they could be trusted because they had no roots in local soil. But if everything is clocks and calendars, if value is measured in weight and in when, what happens when the men who learned the empire's time dare to set it? We have followed the rivermen from monasteries to markets to toll houses to quays, watched their scales click and their calendars fill in. We have felt the city teach them patience and posture. Now the sound changes again. A latch lifts in the dark. Light runs along an axe blade like water down a hull. A hand on brass. Hold the doors, the whisper goes. Not a battle cry, just a sentence in a language that has learned to count. In the next room lies not plunder, but a throne. And around it, a choreography that can make or unmake an emperor by the minute. Step across the threshold with them. Who in this palace of timekeepers is really in control of the clock? The clepsydra starts it. In a shaded alcove of the great palace, a bronze bowl fills one drop at a time, and with each glinting bead of water, the chain of a city tightens. Halls that have slept all night take a breath. Curtains stir. Down the spine of the chrysotriclinos, a hush moves like wind on wheat, chased by the soft rasp of axe hafts sliding against linen. The men at the hinges are already awake. They do not belong to any faction. They are not part of any neighborhood feud of Constantinople. They are the strangers whose word binds only to pay and oath. They are timing the doors. The Varangians look as the chroniclers love to say they did. Tall, fair-bearded, the iron of their axes clean and bright. But the detail that matters is the cadence. They count their steps. They measure their turns to the steps of the court music, that hydra-headed Byzantine melody whose purpose is not entertainment so much as choreography for power. At the inner thresholds, their captain takes a bronze key the size of his forearm, weighs it in one palm, and smiles only because it is heavy as it should be. The emperor's household has a scent, beeswax, myrtle oil, Worms marble, that clings to the inside of your skull. The Varangians keep that smell moving along its proper corridor by the hour. You know this because the Romans of New Rome wrote it down. There is a book whose pages are instructions, not for battles, but for mornings, when the automaton lions should lift their gilt heads and roar from the imperial throne. At what moment the bronze birds in the courtyard must sing. The precise instant the monarch's purple shoes should touch the rug woven with twin-headed eagles, so foreign envoys will think the floor is alive. They recorded the number of steps between the Daphne and the Magnera, who bows first and to what degree. The men at the doors are embedded in this clockwork as surely as a gear in a tower. And in the margins, in a scratched hand no emperor would have noticed, a foreigner carved his proof of life. Halfdan was here. It is a small thing, those runes on a parapet in Hagia Sophia, tucked under a balustrade where a hand might idle in a moment of waiting. But there's a charge in the idea that a man from the north, who grew up in fogged harbors of fur and salt, had a minute to press the edge of his knife and leave himself in the great church of the world. He was on time for the procession. He left a mark where time pooled around a pillar, and then he moved, because the drop in the bowl fell, and the bowl tipped, and the curtain went up. Service in Constantinople paid in gold and in something subtler. There were days when it paid to the second. When an emperor died, an old privilege clicked into motion with the speed of a sprung trap. Pollutisfarf, the stripping of the imperial chambers. The Varangians had a window, tightly bounded, to take their share from the dead man's rooms, plate and chalices, belts and buttons, the glint and clink of a life weighed and swept. It was the most honest statement an empire could make about time, that at the end, it becomes divisible, negotiable, a market in the span between the last breath and the first shout of a new reign. The men with the axes knew this, because it was their work to make the turnover smooth. They stood with keys in their fists at the edge of mortality, and the bell was not metal. It was the balance. What they learned, what many of them brought home, memorialized on stones along Swedish lanes and Danish fields, was not Greek fire or rhetoric, but the discipline of clocks. It seeped into wood and earth. Walk the ridges of Trelleborg or Aggersborg, ring forts like ink strokes stamped into Denmark by Harold Bluetooth, and you feel the metronome. The circles are perfect to a planner's eye, their four gates laid on the cardinal points, as if a surveyor had taken the sun's shadow and drawn a world around it. Houses inside are standardized by finger widths. Bridges on the Jutland plain, like ravening Eng, stretch dead straight over marsh. They don't wind like trails made by hunters. They march. That is not a raider's structure. That is the skeleton of a schedule. Kingship, in the north, grows out of that geometry. A man who could keep a time in Byzantium learned to build a time at home. Harold Bluetooth boasts on his stone at Jelling that he made the Danes Christian and tamed the Danes and Norwegians. There is triumph and menace in that coupling, but also regularity. Christianity in this context is not a misty conversion. It is a calendar. It's Lent and Advent and Ember Days, the rule that tithes come due and markets meet on saints' feasts. It is bells that toll the hours for fasting, wages that fit a week. It takes a seething North Sea and turns it into a ledger that fits in a chest where a woman keeps a heap of keys. If you tilt one of those household chests in light, you see scratches from iron on its lid, circles where the scale pan rested, notches where someone set the balance. Archaeologists find rolled-up lengths of hacked silver, tied with twine, and tucked next to dies for stamping coin. And there in the center, a set of clackety little bronze weights, nested, each one a fraction of a whole. In graves, we see them beside women as often as men, because at the point where the raid becomes rent, it is the house that becomes the bank. The days become accounted. If you walk the lanes of Sigtuna after the mid starts up, and listen between the caw of rooks and the creak of cartwheels, you might hear from a doorway the precise chink of a payment into a cloth bag, and the soft commentary of whoever keeps the book in their head. Allowed to speak now, because the machines of silver no longer flow in wild rivers from Samarkand. And still, the long shadow is there. Slaves are now written into the mornings. If the church forbids the sale of Christians, then men learn to name their captives properly to keep the paper clean. Dublin hums as a market. The gaunt youths out of the interior, the women with tuned despair, the worn-out men sold cheap to row. The South has always made its own righteousness an engine for our contraband. The North learns to do the same. The new world of timesheets and tolls feels civilized if you only look at the coins, but it has the same heat of human bodies. Only now they are itemized. The bell rings, the count is taken, the gate closes. While this happens at home, the North bleeds east down the Dnieper and west across England in new uniforms. Canute the Great sits on a throne stitched out of North Sea winds. At Winchester, he counts out Hergeld to a Viking fleet to keep it loyal, and calls that normal governance. In Rome, he writes a proud letter to the English that he has negotiated better tolls for pilgrims, which is to say, he is winning by calendar. The point of the empire is not banners, it's dates. When coin is due back to the die cutter, when oaths must be repeated at midwinter, when ships must be at straits so the tides match the wagons. He learns to travel with a pocket full of Sundays, and when he kneels at tombs in Italy, do you think he does not count the steps between basilicas? He is making a map of holy time to drape over the sea. But the most precise cut of this story is the one that falls at a river bridge in Yorkshire. In 1066, a man who had once kept the emperor's minute book with a blade, Harold Hardrada, Harold the Hard Ruler, the empire candidate from the north, who had stood in the sludge of palace intrigue and chopped men's ambitions to the second, comes back with a last timetable. He means to take a crown the way you take a harbor. You arrive before the harbor master wakes up. His oars beat like a pendulum up the Humber. He times York between fares. He meets an English force at Fulford, breaks it with the snap of a plan that's worked 100 times from Ladoga to Lombardy. Then he rests. He rests because resting has always been part of the plan. Men don't swing two-handed axes in mail all afternoon and then tramp in formation all night. Ships don't sprout horses from their bellies without missteps. He leaves part of his gear at the shicks. He believes in the Old North, that the other side's bell will toll for terce before their shoes are on. What he does not count on is a man who has learned a new trick with a clock. Harold Godwinson, King of the English, hot from a coronation measured to a day, hot to a promise to the South he cannot ignore, does what rulers in the 11th century are beginning to understand is victory. He compresses time. The march from the South is not just a feat of muscle, it is administration. He flips obligations like counters on a table to produce wagons and bread. He uses the road network. He urges his men through nights because he can count on nights that are lit by known stars at known hours. He closes the gap between map and body in a way that makes the old schedules look timid. And so when he crests the ridge at Stamford Bridge and the Norwegians are on their leisure day by a river, under a sun that could have given them 100 victories on 100 other mornings, the alarm that goes up is not chaos. It's a line snapping taut in a sound you can hear at the back of your teeth. Harold Hardrada, the last great graduate of Constantinople's school of timing, pivots, refuses armor, roars himself into the saga hour. He is killed. A generation of runestones is carved. Within weeks, the true hinge reveals itself. The same king who moved like a calendar on legs has to wheel south to meet another storm, this one wearing a cross inside a kite-shaped shield. The Normans, the Northmen who sat long enough in Frankish fields to fatten on Latin charters and cavalry rosters, arrive not as raiders, but as notaries who can ride. Their monks hold styluses like spears. They will count the sheep of England in a book that rivals any imperial scroll for its ice-hearted accuracy. They will build an exchequer where tally sticks, not sword strokes, strike the rhythm of rule. They will speak a rite so punctual that a peasant knows to the season when to fear the reeve's knock, and they will hang time on parish bells like cloaks on pegs. They are the final echo of the raider who learned that the real weapon is a calendar. But they walked one step past raid and made schedules of faith. In the islands, out in the cold, where men and women have been gathering for a century at a rocky rift to speak law, the same transformation takes a quiet, radiant form. The Althing in Iceland opens every summer, and the law speaker stands on the law rock and recites 1/3 of the code year after year, so that in 3 summers the whole law has been said aloud, and memory keeps measure. It is a human clock with a voice. When the island must choose whether to keep its gods or take a cross, a man named Thorgir lies under his cloak for a day and a night, and comes up with a compromise fitted to the sun. 2 calendars in one body, the old as private, the new as public, so that feuds do not devour the timetable of survival. You can feel how North and South have braided through him, how the discipline of Constantinople has met the stubborn calculus of a farm under lava. In a church cut of stone on a wet knoll in England, a bell rings out 7 times to move men through matins. In a market behind Dublin's quays, a small ring of metal clacks on a balance, and a life changes hands. In a workshop in Sigtuna, a moneyer strikes the die and prays his silver is not light. In a palace on the Bosporus, a drop of water sprunes out of a cup and sets a set of hidden doors in motion. These are the same sound. They are the logistics of a world that found that the time, measured, divided, weighted, promised, is the one commodity that multiplies everything it touches. What history does not tend to tell you about Viking raids is that they were not eruptions from a void, but plugs pulled in a great system of bathhouses and bastions and villages where the heat was regulated by bells and balances. When the dirham flow slackened, the North did not die back into heath. It minted its own seconds and stamped them into circles. When Greek fire burned out a set of ambitions, treaties sketched new lanes whose rules had their own dangers, as confining as any chain. When women counted in doorways with keys at their belts, and men scraped their names in domes because they had a minute to breathe, what tied them together was not mythic rage, but the same human compromise that governs all ages of merchants and mercenaries. You either control the hour, or you become its cargo. And the cost? It is everywhere. In names no one speaks because the ledgers only recorded weight. In shoulders bent over oars to keep time with a steersman. In children who never see the men who went east to Greece, and whose mothers bought and sold in their stead. In the final ring of axes hitting shields on a riverbank, as a last attempt to yell down a clock that had already chimed. The Vikings, in the end, were not conquered by some greater ferocity, but by an empire of minutes that they helped to found. They were not undone by Jesus, so much as by January and June. Walk back through the palace corridors one more time. The automaton lions are still. The bronze birds have gone mute. The sweat of men at the hinges dries on cold stone, and a carved name catches dust under a railing, where tourists will someday trail their fingers. The clepsydra is emptied, someone forgets to fill it, and a ceremony starts late. But the attention has shifted. Outside these walls, a village bell calls men to work. A tax cart rolls, a thing is sitting. Oversees a shipmaster, squints at horizon light, he calls us sunstone, and guesses noon. Centuries slow turn into a continent of schedules so tight that even kings feel strangled. Did the raiders know what they'd helped to summon? On a night of north dawn light, when sea ice lies like torn vellum on a black fjord, and a farmer brings in his ewes on a date set by the bishop's book, there's a flicker of understanding in the flat of his knife as he strips a twig. This is protection as much as it is prison. The bell that told him when to fear a sail now tells him when to bring grain to a storehouse to meet the law, and the law has an hourglass on its desk. We began with a bell at Lindisfarne and ended with a balance in a palace. The Vikings taught the world to hear one inside the other. That is the revelation not written in your schoolbook raid calendar. The terror was punctual, the mercy scheduled, the wealth weighed, and as the axe became a key, then somewhere in that exchange is a lesson about what empires are. The door opens by the minute. Whoever holds the minute holds the door. We live in that house now. We measure with finer instruments, that is all. We've replaced bowls and bells with screens and server farms. We've made the routes invisible and the oars virtual. We call our Danegeld subscriptions and our treaties terms of service. If the raiders had a trick, it was to make a weapon out of the ordinary mathematics of life. The question their story presses across the long surf of time is not whether they were more savage than we imagined. It is much colder and much closer. When the balance tilts and the door unlocks, who sets the hour today? And whose hands are already on the hinges waiting for the bell?